the last lecture of the lecture series on chemical oceanography will be about coral reefs. Okay, so you might have had some of the kind of introductory of what a coral reef is in the benthic ecosystem stuff that Sian might have given you. If one person's nods, right, you've all seen it. So what we're going to be talking about today is the impact of ocean chemistry on these kind of quite important tropical marine ecosystems. And just a bit of a recap of how a coral kind of works. So a coral is actually an animal. It's kind of related to the sea anemone, and it basically feeds using these little tentacle things that maybe grab on some food and move it towards this mouth area here, and then it's got this stomach which it can absorb kind of nutrients and carbon through, and then its mouth is also its anus, which is rather unpleasant, and it's a very simple organism. Okay, so it just filter feeds food and then poops it out of its mouth again. Okay. Now the interesting thing about some corals that live near the sea surface, so some corals live throughout the whole depth of the ocean, so in really, really deep water, up to 4,500 meters. But the ones that you'll probably be familiar with from kind of like Blue Planet and fancy TV stuff is the pretty looking ones that are near the surface, and they're pretty because they've got these algae that live inside all these little tiny dots you can see here. Each one of those is a little algae cell, and that is basically living inside the animal. So it's kind of like a plant living inside an animal. So that plant basically can photosynthesize because light can shine through the transparent port of the coral. It can produce organic matter and oxygen, which the animal can then use as a food source. Okay, so the animal can then effectively eat the waste products of the algae, and the waste products that the coral give off, which are kind of CO2 and some nutrients, they can be basically taken back up into the algae. So it's a symbiosis between the algae and the coral. They're basically helping each other out, eating stuff, and oh no. Well, for those that are wanting the recording, just got trodden on, which is unfortunate. Well, we'll see if that works. Okay, so that's what a coral is. So it's both respiring and photosynthesizing. Oh, yeah, if you've not picked up a thing, there's a thing. Sorry, here we go. Okay, so last year there was an event that happened across quite a lot of the ocean, and it was in the media quite a lot, this idea of coral bleaching. So this is when corals get something in the environment, causes the corals to be a little bit unhappy, and they eject these symbiotic algae out of their bodies. So this doesn't kill the coral is still alive, it's able to filter feed food, but it's no longer able to do that photosynthesis part of the whole fiasco. So it's in a kind of a weakened state. So it's less food available because there's no organic material being produced by photosynthesis. And this was, I guess, so this basically, you have like a healthy coral that's got these algal symbionts living in it, and then the coral gets kind of stressed out and goes, ooh, I'm a little bit unhappy with these things living inside me. Okay, because if there was something living inside you and you got all hot and bothered, you'd probably want to get that thing living inside you out. So that's what happens. And this is an example from, I guess, the El Nino previous to the last one. So you've got a nice healthy coral reef, and you can see it's kind of all pretty coloured. Unfortunately, all your slides are in black and white because I couldn't get the colour printer to work. And then something happens to the water to make the corals not want to have those algae in them anymore. So they eject the algae. So this coral reef is just as alive as this one over here. Okay, it's just not able to photosynthesize anymore. And that's fine, as long as that only happens for a short amount of time. And if conditions return to normal, then the corals can find some more algae and put that inside them, and then they're all happy again. But if this state persists for an amount of time, that basically stresses out the corals for long enough that they're unable to get enough energy to live, because they can only filter feed, they can't do this symbiotic photosynthesis, then eventually the coral reef will die, and then you've just got a bunch of kind of calcium carbonate sticks, which is less good. Okay, and this bleaching occurs typically when you have abnormally high temperatures. So it's not a certain temperature threshold by which you go above and then corals start bleaching, because in some parts of the ocean the corals are actually used to living in much warmer water than other parts of the ocean. It's basically, if it's anomalous, if it's unusually high for that region, unusually high for that region, then the corals will bleach. Okay, but it's not an absolute temperature threshold. And this tends to happen in the Pacific and Indian Oceans during El Nino years, which is another lecture, but it's basically in cycles of 7 to 11 years. Parts of the Indian over here, Pacific Oceans, tend to get a lot warmer than average. Okay, so there's this problem of bleaching, and so far that's not been about chemistry, but just bear in mind that it happens. The other thing we need to know about is the actual shape of these coral reef systems, because that has quite a big impact on how water can exchange from the deep ocean out here, okay, to this relatively, well, it's not relatively, it's usually extremely shallow, sometimes down to 0 meters in places, coral reef platform, which is built out over, in this case, at least hundreds of thousands of years. This is the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. I think Townsville is down here. Cairns is further up to the north. For those that know your Queensland geography. So we end up with this very wide platform that's got lots of corals growing on it. And then if you look at the boundary between the deep ocean and this platform, there's this region of shallow water here. We have this barrier reef. So it's actually very difficult to exchange water across this between these two things. Okay, it can do. I mean, I wouldn't recommend swimming across it. You'd probably be ripped to shreds by the waves. But it's less exchangey than the open ocean. The other thing is that the other side of that platform is quite often land. It's not always land. It could be a coral atoll. And that land will have rivers running off it, and those rivers will be bringing with them a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, so you can see a big plume of sediment coming out here. This sediment quite often gets trapped in mangrove environments. So this is a mangrove swamp. You can see all of these roots have trapped all of this sediment. Okay, so that somewhat prevents that sediment getting out onto the coral platform. Sometimes that sediment is routed through the reef, okay, from one side to the other in channels and gets straight out to sea and doesn't really interact with the coral reefs at all. But sometimes it does. And it's not just sediment that river is bringing with it, it's also bringing nutrients, okay, and fresh water, all things which can have an effect on the corals. Okay, so sediments, nutrients and fresh water can all impact the health of these lovely fancy corals, which are fun to go dive on. Okay, so we're going to have a look about what's happening to the chemistry now of these things. And we can basically simplify. There are two main processes that are happening on a coral reef, which is geochemically. One is the production of organic matter. So things are photosynthesizing. So I mentioned corals can photosynthesize those symbiotic algae. That's taking CO2 from the water and converting that into organic matter. And the other thing that they're doing is that they produce calcium carbonate. Okay, so corals, if you've ever seen a coral or picked one up that's dead, don't pick up live corals, it kind of kills them. But they're made of rock. Okay, so they're made of calcium carbonate. And you can see that you can see there's a coral here. This is a sponge that's actually making silica. But all of this white stuff around it, okay, that's little particles of calcium carbonate that have been broken out of corals and things that produce hard skeletons. Okay, usually something comes along and nibbles at the coral, like a parrotfish or something, and the parrotfish then kind of spits out or poops out coral powder. Okay. So corals, they do this. So corals produce both organic matter and calcium carbonate. Okay. It's not just, there's no point me saying this again, that's a coral, it poops out its mouth, fun, fun, fun. But it's not just corals that do this, these chemical processes. This is a group of algae that also produce a calcium carbonate kind of skeleton. They secrete calcium carbonate underneath their algal cells. So this is a red algae called, whatever this is, lithoaminion and lithophyllum, something or other. Those are words that nobody ever needs to know. But they look like corals. They certainly feel like corals. If you stamp on one, it will pierce your foot like an absolute painfulness. But they're producing organic matter and they're producing calcium carbonate. Some by the fire door, if you want to. And is there a thing? Is there a thing? Do you want a thing? Lovely things. We've got all kinds of things here. Yeah, sweet. So this is another kind of algae, and rather than just be kind of like gooey algae that's kind of coating a surface, this actually kind of grows in little platelets that form something that looks a little bit like seagrass. So this is an organism called Halimeda, and it actually grows these kind of little calcium carbonate plates, which then get coated in algae. So it's producing organic matter and calcium carbonate. Sea urchins, there's quite a lot of sea urchins on coral reefs. They kind of are one of the main predators of corals. They tend not to be so photosynthesizing. They contain organic matter. Some of them do have symbiotic algae, but by the most they just produce calcium carbonate. Okay. There is another by the back, yeah. Or you could sit in the middle.
I'm on the back.
Yeah, it's fine. Foraminifera, you might have heard them with Simon about planktonic and benthic forams. So these are some benthic forams. These are mostly just producing calcium carbonate. Here are some nice pink ones from Bermuda. If you ever go to Bermuda, the beaches are pink because of these lovely forams. Other than that, it's a horrible place to go to. Really is. I mean, it's just golf courses and rich white people. It's horrible. Fish. So fish don't produce organic matter, and they're made of organic matter. They basically eat other things. But actually, fish have a system which basically controls their internal chemistry, their internal pH and alkalinity. So when they basically breathe in or actually swallow seawater, to maintain kind of the chemistry inside the fish, they actually precipitate out little crystals of calcium carbonate, mostly high magnesium calcite. So these are SEM images of fish poo. So these are actually producing calcium carbonate in the water column. And it actually turns out that this is probably one of the largest sources of calcium carbonate production in the ocean, but it's only recognized relatively recently. We also have things that just produce organic matter and that don't produce calcium carbonate shells, so things like seagrasses. So this is kind of things that manatees go on and eat. There's one over there. You've got to climb over to get it. I know how to get it. There's some around. And is there any more things, or was that? No handout for you, I'm afraid. Too slow, chicken meringue. So things also produce just organic matter. So to recap of the chemistry that's going on. So we've got this process of photosynthesis, okay, and I guess the opposite of photosynthesis, it's not a back reaction, is this respiration. I should point out that these are absolutely not the chemical equations of photosynthesis or respiration. Okay, if anybody's doing a biology degree, kind of look away now. They are just kind of a summary reaction to the things that photosynthesis uses, CO2 and water, and the things that it produces, oxygen and organic matter. Okay, and respiration is kind of the opposite of that. It takes organic matter and an oxidizer, usually oxygen, and produces CO2. Okay, that's what we do, and we do like breathing. Okay, and the other thing that I've been talking about is this calcium carbonate production, and these are the equations of production. So dissolved calcium ions and bicarbonate ions in the water column, they are converted into this mineral calcium carbonate, okay, and this actually gives off CO2. And this is a little bit counterintuitive, because you think if I've got some carbon dissolved in the water and I'm producing from that water calcium carbonate, which is made of carbon. I'm taking that out of the ocean and putting that into sediments or corals. You think that would lower the amount of carbon in the ocean. And it does. It does lower the total amount of carbon in the ocean, but it actually causes the amount of CO2 in the ocean to go up. Okay. So photosynthesis removes CO2 from the water. Carbonate production adds it to the water. And obviously the opposite of carbonate formation, carbonate dissolution. So we take basically calcium carbonate and we take this acid, carbonic acid, and the acid and the base neutralize each other and we dissolve into our original ions. And the way we get this carbonic acid, it's just the reaction of CO2 and water. And there's lots of water in the ocean, so any CO2 in the ocean will form some carbonic acid, which will ultimately dissolve some calcium carbonate. Right. Okay, so I'm going to see if you followed that by having a bit of a quiz. So photosynthesis, that removes CO2. Okay. Now, if we look at the chemistry of carbon in the water, and I think this was in one of the videos which some of you watched, not all of you. That when we take CO2 and water and allow those to interact with each other, we'll form carbonic acid. That carbonic acid will dissociate, just spontaneously break apart, to form bicarbonate ion, this is HCO3 minus, and a H plus. Okay? And then that will break apart further and form another H plus. So if we add CO2 to the water, we should get these formed. Okay? And the other thing is that the pH of an aqueous solution is approximately, it's not actually the concentration, it's the activity, but let's just go back to high school chemistry and think that the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution can be related to this term pH, which is the negative of the log to the base 10 of the concentration of hydrogen ions. Okay? So when you've got lots of hydrogen ions, this number is negative, small. Whereas if you've got very few of them, okay, this becomes less negative. Okay? So, sorry, if this is very small, then this is positive. Anyway. So, the first one, photosynthesis. So, if you think it's going to go up, put your hand up. If you think it's going to go down, put your hand on your chin, let's say, right? Down, up, yeah? Okay, so photosynthesis, that removes CO2, takes CO2 out of the water. So, what's that going to do to the hydrogen ion concentration? Up or down? Oh, don't look around the room with everyone else. Okay, is this thinking? Or I should have thought this through. Right, so we're taking away CO2. Okay, we're forming this stuff. Okay, so if we take away CO2, these are equilibrium reactions. So we lower the concentration of CO2. So these reactions are all going to want to go to the left-hand side. Yeah? Which means that will lower the concentration of everything over on this side. Yeah? So, photosynthesis. It removes CO2. So what's it does to the hydrogen ion concentration? It just looks like thinking. Yeah, so most people are either thinking or not sure, unwilling to engage in any way, goes down. Okay? So the pH will go... Oh, come on, play the game, otherwise it's not fun. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so respiration is going to make the hydrogen ion concentration up or down? Up. And down with a beard. Okay, right, so carbonate production, if we grow lots of kind of coral skeletons or foraminifera, we're producing carbonate. Okay, so that's doing this equation here, adding CO2 to the water. So that's going to make the hydrogen ion concentration go up. okay, and pH will go down, and I'm not going to, anyway, okay? So hopefully that made some sense to some of you, or at least gave you some exercise. Okay, so we're now going to go to a coral reef and actually look what happens, okay, on the scale of an island kind of thing. So this is Palmyra Atoll. It's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's a kind of a quite constitutionally strange place, but it's hardly anyone lives there because it's of this. It's not really part of the United States of America. It's kind of owned by the United States of America. The Constitution kind of applies there. It's effectively the personal fiefdom of the president. But I think 4 people lived there when that picture was taken, so it's not such a big deal. But it is, it basically is a pristine site. There's almost no anthropogenic perturbations that have gone on there at all. So this is a map of the islands. So these are the islands in the middle here, and then this line around the edge is that fringing reef. Okay, so everything inside that is this lagoon, kind of shallow lagoon setting. And we've got 2 stations, RT and FR. I can't remember what they stand for, but what's happened is they put out some sensors and measured the temperature of the water and the pH of the water through time. So if we just focus on the pH, which are the blue ones here, so the top one is the one in the middle, and the bottom one is the one at the edge. Okay? And the other thing to point out are these horizontal black lines. Okay? The horizontal black lines are the average conditions in the ocean outside of the atoll, so the open ocean conditions. And they don't change very much. Okay? It's relatively stable temperature, relatively stable pH. There is some seasonal variability, so in the summer it gets warmer, but it's, it's fairly near the tropics, so it's in the tropics, it's near the equator. Not a huge annual cycle, but that annual cycle is represented by this dashed line on the pH, and you can see that there, on an annual cycle, you might get that much variability. Look at this tiny change there. So the first thing to notice is that there is some variability. You can see that the pH goes up and down, 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 up and down. Yeah? We'll see that. And the other thing to note is that it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, a lot more in the middle, over here, than it does on the edge. Yep. Okay? The other thing to point out is that the average, if we were to do the average of the blue lines along here, the average is lower, so the pH is lower than the surrounding ocean. Okay, so everything should be on this black line, but it's kind of roughly where the blue line is, and even the average of this wiggle, 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 wiggle up here is even below the seasonal low of outside of the island. So something is lowering the pH, and something is causing it to be highly variable. Okay? So, what? So I guess the other observation that we need to make here is what is the frequency of this up and down? How fast does it go up and down? Okay, so what we're going to do is zoom in, and we can see that that up and down is actually a day-night cycle. It takes a day to go up and a day to go down. Right? So this is actually data that's not from that island. It's data from a series of what we call mesocosm experiments. So it's a little bit like a lab experiment, except your lab is just a really, really big bucket. Okay, maybe a tank of water that's, 10 meters or so across, that you can actually put corals in and make the tide go up and down and all kinds of crazy stuff. Anyway, so the thing to note on this is that you can see in the blue, which on yours is kind of probably the lighter, second lightest grey, the squares here, that's the amount of sunlight, irradiance. So you can see in the daytime it's sunny, and in the nighttime it is not. And then the other things that have been plotted on this, it's probably just worth looking at the red one, and that's the corals and the algae. And what's been plotted here is how much, or what is the rate of calcium carbonate production. Okay? And you can see that the rate of calcium carbonate production is highest in the daytime, and it's lower at night, but even at night it's still producing calcium carbonate. They're still growing. Okay? So let's see how that affects the chemistry. So what we've got here is that plot that I've just showed you up in this corner up here. And down at the bottom we've got oxygen concentration. So we can see here one of the effects of that light is that in the daytime the oxygen concentration is going up, and that's because photosynthesis is occurring. Okay? But at night time the photosynthesis goes away and we just get respiration, so the concentration of oxygen is low. Okay? So we get photosynthesis only during the daytime, and if we then think about what that should do to the pH, okay, if we get photosynthesis during the day, then that should cause there to be removing CO2, should cause the hydrogen ion concentration to go down and the pH to go up. Okay? And we can see that in the pH curve here. So in the daytime, the pH is at its highest. Okay? And then at night time, okay, it's at its lowest, because not only is there no photosynthesis going on, so only respiration, but we've also got this carbonate production. So if we just ignore the photosynthesis for now and just think about the carbonate production, so we've got lots of carbonate production in the day, okay, and that should cause the pH to go down because we're adding CO2 to the water, okay, and that should cause the pH to go down. Because you can see that the pH doesn't go down, so that means that there is more photosynthesis going on than there is carbonate production during the day. So it's what the pH is reflecting here is not just photosynthesis or respiration or carbonate production or carbonate dissolution. It's the balance between the two. Okay, so in the daytime, photosynthesis wins out over carbonate production, and that causes there to be a raise in pH, whereas at night time, photosynthesis loses because it goes to zero, so pH falls. Okay, so let's just point out that there's this thing that we can calculate, this omega aragonite, based on the concentrations of calcium and carbonate ion, and this is what happens when the pH changes. We change this parameter called the saturation state, which basically means that as pH goes up, we have more carbonate ion, so this number gets bigger. When pH goes down, we'll get less carbonate ion. Okay, so this is the carbonate ion here. So if pH goes down, which means we've got lots of hydrogen ions, which will force all of these terms to the left-hand side, and that will use up some carbonate ion. So if the pH goes down, we lower this parameter, which is basically the aragonite saturation state, which is when that gets to 1. So if it's bigger than 1, that means aragonite should be spontaneously crystallizing out of the solution. Okay? If it's less than 1, it'll spontaneously dissolve. Okay? So when this is low, corals start dissolving. Okay? Which is not good if you're a coral. Okay? So we can then have a look at some of the maybe indirect aspects. So it's not just if we are changing the pH up and down and the pH gets too low, the corals will dissolve. So what this is a series of experiments where they've taken a bunch of corals. So these are, I guess the one on the left is actually an algae, this porolithon. Then we've got aquapora and a porites coral. And what we're looking at here is each of these little graphs are 3 experiments. Okay, so they basically grew the corals at pH 8 to pH 8.4. So that's kind of roughly where the ocean is now, or was. And then decreasing pH, so 7.9 and 7.8. Okay, so getting progressively more acidic as we move over to the right-hand side. So you can see at the bottom ones here, these are the percent calcification. So how well are these corals calcifying? So at lower pH, the coral should be dissolving more, should be finding it harder to calcify. And that's what we can see here. We can see a trend going kind of down, okay, to less calcification. In the case of the algae, they're actually starting to dissolve. Okay? So that's what the effect of changing the pH is, but it's not just whether they dissolve or can grow these skeletons. You can see that it affects their productivity, so it actually affects how they're able to photosynthesize. Okay, you can see photosynthesis is decreasing with decreased pH. And the top is actually their susceptibility to bleaching. Okay, so they basically tried to artificially bleach some corals, and the ones that were under the normal conditions, so this one, and this one, you can see that the incidence of bleaching is about 20%, 15%, maybe 5 or 10%. So the corals are fairly robust. They're responding quite well to this environmental stress. But at these lower pHs, if you raise the temperature and try and bleach the corals, over half of them are bleaching now. So the corals are more susceptible to bleaching if you lower the pH. So this is kind of like I guess a summary of this kind of like concept. So if you have the pH across the bottom here, so this is kind of where the ocean is roughly now, and as you add CO2 to the ocean, the pH will go down. Okay, as we acidify the ocean, and that lowers this saturation state, so we start then lowering this towards 1, and this has progressively worsening effects on the abilities of the corals to grow their skeletons and survive these bleaching effects. So this is I guess a slightly more nuanced example of that. So rather than just look at the pH, because the average pH is kind of somewhat meaningless in these conditions, because the pH is changing to kind of normal conditions to extreme coral death, okay, on a daily cycle. Okay, so this idea that low pH of, where do we go back to? Low pH of 7.8, something like that, is going to be really bad for our corals. If you look at this whole range, it goes from 8 and a bit to 7.8, something like that, right? If we look at the daily cycle, we've got 8 and a bit to 7.9. Okay, so on a daily cycle, coral reefs are actually experiencing quite a large shift in pH, and actually they're quite happy about that. Okay, because they're causing it. Okay, the reason this cycle exists is because of the corals. So what matters though is how long each day, okay, the corals spend above a certain pH, okay, that allows them to calcify. So they can be kind of sitting in a very unpleasant, acidic bit of water for most of the day, and they go, oh, I cannot grow, this is really horrible. But then conditions allow them to grow for maybe a few hours, and they're good. Okay? So this is the mean sum of pH, the sum of pH per day above some calcification threshold. Okay? And you can see that as that increases, these guys here increase in their percent cover, increase in their calcification rate, and everything is good. Okay? So it's not just the absolute mean value of pH, it's the amount per day that it spends above that threshold. So actually, it's not just the mean that matters, it's this variability. If you have high variance, then you'll get more time above some threshold for any mean pH value. And just to have an overview of where globally pH in the ocean is going. So this is CO2 concentration in the atmosphere measured at Mauna Loa on Hawaii, and the CO2 concentration in the water in an oceanographic station nearby. And you can see that the water CO2 content is going up, just like atmospheric CO2 is going up, up. And you can see quite nicely here the pH of that water is going down. So as we're adding CO2, in this case, we're externally forcing the system. This isn't the CO2 being added or taken away by respiration or carbonate production of the corals themselves. This is us just adding CO2 to the system. So there's this overall decline in pH. So this is having an effect globally on the average, okay, but it's not having an effect on the variability. Okay, so just quickly to summarize this effect of CO2. So CO2 can be added to the water, okay, by us burning fossil fuels, but it can also be added, again, down here by the respiration of organic matter, okay, or the production of calcium carbonate. This can be an acidifying thing which causes the breakdown of coral reefs. It makes them calcify less, which is effectively the same as saying they dissolve more, which if they're less well calcified, they're easier to bioerode, so things can come along and eat them and break them up into this kind of calcium carbonate mud, which is much easier then to dissolve back up into the water column. So it's not just the chemistry, there's an interaction between the chemistry, its effect on corals, its effect on the whole kind of community of things that are eating those corals. But overall, the effect of adding CO2 is to acidify the local ocean and to make it less happy for corals to do their thing. Okay, so that's the CO2 kind of carbonate system part of the chemistry. So I asked you guys to have a look at the video on nutrients. And that's just really to give you an idea of what nutrients are. There are some elements which are essential for life. So if you want to have any organic matter production, you don't just need some CO2 and some water and you can just do photosynthesis. You need some other elements there. You need nitrate, you need phosphate. So basically it's just like, you know, if you're a farmer, you want to grow some, whatever it is farmers grow, you need to add some fertilizer to the land, right? Or you need to get nutrients out of the soil to enable that growth to occur. Okay? So coral reefs are just the same, except that most coral reefs are in this region, or in regions of the ocean, which are what we would call oligotrophic, which is a fancy pants word for really low nutrients. Okay? So they need some nutrients, but they're usually in parts of the ocean. Okay, so this is Heron Island on the Great Barrier Reef. It's where I got my job. Here, I had a chat with the head of the department on that beach there. It was really good. Anyway, it's a great place if you ever get to go there. It's got a nice little research station and a 5-star hotel. Anyway, you can see that there's no supply of nutrients to this island, right? It's surrounded by water. Rivers don't flow into it. Okay, you might get some nutrients upwelling in some of the deep water, but this is on that platform. So the water around here is maybe only 30, 40 meters deep. Okay, it's not upwelling from the deep ocean. It's quite well isolated from sources of nutrients, which means you get quite a lot of things like this. This is a sponge. I think I've posted a video somewhere of how this thing is basically pumping water through it, just to try and extract as much from the water as possible because there are so few nutrients available. So how do these nutrients affect the corals? Okay, and there are basically two groups of effects. There are these direct effects, which are a little bit weird and poorly understood, and there are indirect effects, which are actually kind of a little bit more obvious. So we'll just go into those in one by one. So I guess first of all, the direct effects. So the corals need some nutrients. Okay, so if there's no nutrients, the corals will not be able to grow. Nothing will be able to grow. Everything will be completely dead. Okay, so if you have a very small amount of nutrients and you increase the nutrient concentration, so this is a graph showing increasing nutrient concentration, and this is basically coral happiness on the vertical axis. So if you increase from very low to a low concentration, the corals go, yay, I could make some organic material, and they grow. They don't need a lot of nutrients because they're really effective at recycling them through their symbiotic algae, right? So the algae can produce, use the nutrients to produce some organic matter. That organic matter gets kind of like eaten by the coral breathes that organic matter out, or eats it, and releases nutrients back into the algae, and it's internally cycled. So they're quite happy at low nutrient concentrations, but then when you get to very high nutrient concentrations, they suddenly get not very happy. Okay, so the reasons for that are actually quite poorly understood, but one of them is that if you grow corals in a low nutrient environment, and then the green ones are in high nutrient environments here. So these are a series of experiments, and you basically, if you just look at what we've got here is ones on this side are the beginning of the experiment, and they grew some corals. This is the bleaching prevalence, so how often the corals are bleaching, and this is how diseased they are. Okay, so corals get diseases like kind of all animals get diseases. Then also very poorly understood, they have quite obvious names. So I think this is kind of black band disease because it's got a black band. They call this one white plague. So this is not bleaching, it's actually something else that's going on, but it's just because it goes white, and that's what they called it that. White band, different to white plague, because it's got bands, and yeah, they're not very imaginative, they don't really know a lot about them, what kind of organisms or pathogens like microbes are causing them. But you can see when you start the experiment, okay, if you have lots of nutrients, the corals are more diseased. Okay? When you start the experiment, there's no real difference in how susceptible they are to bleaching. Okay? 6 months later, however, okay, 6 months later, you've carried on adding lots and lots of nutrients, and you can see that the disease has gone down in all of the corals. That's because you've kind of killed off the weakest ones. Okay? But you can still see that the high nutrient environment has got more prevalence of disease, and it's had a big effect on bleaching. So with high nutrients, the corals are more susceptible to bleaching, okay? Which is a shame. The good news in this experiment was, though, that when you stopped like dicking around with the corals, when you left them alone in a low nutrient environment, if you took them back to normal, then they kind of recover to the same as the control. So if you leave them alone, they're fine. If you carry on pouring nutrients on them, then they're not happy. So we don't really know why this happens. Okay? Here's a coral. You can see these dark patches in here. These are these symbiotic algae. So in a high nutrient environment, we don't really know why the coral is unhappy with these things being in them. Okay? It's just a thing we don't know. So this is a summary paper of what these direct effects are if we change the nutrient conditions. So if we either add nutrients or change the type of nutrients. This is a summary, and you're never going to read all of this, but basically I've summarized it by color. So some studies show that if you add nutrients, you get more zooxanthellae. So these are the symbiotic algae. They're called zooxanthellae. But some studies say there's no change. Some say that their experiments show they get reduced calcification rates, and some say increased calcification rates, and some say we can't tell. So it's an area of research we don't really have a very strong handle on at the moment, but there is something going on in the corals where if you stress them with nutrients, they don't like it, but we don't know why they don't like it. Okay, so that's the direct effect. That's kind of like me giving you something and it making you ill. But there are also these indirect effects. So if you add nutrients, other things happen to the environment rather than just the direct, toxicity of the nutrients. So the most obvious is that if you put a bunch of nutrients in some water, kind of algae will grow. Okay, if you go and see a pond anywhere, it'll have lots of nutrients in it. It'll be green and horrible. Yeah. We actually have a pond in the Grant Institute that's used for cooling some of the mass spectrometers, and it is disgusting. And it's got all this kind of algae growing in it, and this algae will just cover everything. Okay, so if you have lots of nutrients, that'll get this very fast-growing algae going, yeah, nutrients, I can like grow some biomass, and they just smother the corals. So this is an example of, it doesn't have to be algae that's kind of gooey and sitting on the sea floor. It can be algae in the water column. Okay, so phytoplankton. If you have lots of nutrients, you'll have a phytoplankton bloom, and that can just cut out the amount of light that's making it down to the corals. So by smothering them or just cutting off their light source, the corals are going to do less well. So this is another example of a benthic algae here, smothering this lovely coral here. Okay, so it's basically just outcompeting it for space because these soft algae can grow really, really quickly in the presence of lots of nutrients. So it's not just smothering, there's chemical warfare going on as well. So seaweed, so algae that kind of forms seaweed, doesn't like being eaten, right? If you're a plant and you keep on getting eaten, it's not very good for you. So plants sometimes develop a kind of a strategy to stop predators eating them, and they become toxic. So they start excreting toxic chemicals. So this was an experiment basically taking lots of little corals which they kind of snapped off and then glued onto little bits of rock and then put in this crate here, and then they left some alone, and then they tied seaweed onto some of them. And the seaweed, you can see in this figure down here, they've taken the seaweed off, they cable tied it on. It's basically killed the bit of coral that it was attached to. It's just by touching it, okay, it's caused coral death. And that's what you can see in these plots here. So along the bottom, you've just basically got lots of different kinds of coral, okay, and you've got seaweed, coral, different kinds of seaweed along the bottom, and each one of these things is a coral. And you can see that if you are adding the seaweed to this coral, the bleaching instances go down. Okay, so this is like adding stuff. So this is the control. They've not added anything. Then these are just different kinds of seaweed. Okay, and then for the top one up here, we've got the bleaching. So you can see by not doing anything, there's no change in the amount of bleaching. If you add all of these kind of seaweeds, that increases the bleaching effect on the coral. So it's making them, not only is it just killing them by putting it on there, it's also making them less happy. This is just a different kind of coral, different species of porites, and you see this one is slightly a little bit more robust to seaweed contact. And then the bottom is basically this effective quantum yield is basically how good it is at photosynthesizing. And you can see as you add seaweed, the photosynthetic effectiveness goes down. So by adding nutrients, we grow lots of seaweed and we kind of smother these corals, but we also kind of chemically attack them by some of the toxins the seaweeds are giving out. Okay, so it's not just chemical warfare, it's biological warfare as well. If you have some corals, okay, lovely corals, you add some nutrients, oh no. So you get lots of algae growing, and that can be algae in the water column, or it could be kind of benthic algae, okay? And because that's relatively fast growing, it's also going to decay away quite quickly. So when you're decaying lots of organic matter, you'll be adding dissolved organic carbon to the water. So basically it's plant goo. And if you have lots of organic carbon in the water, that's basically lots of carbon that's available for microbes to use as a food source. So you'll get lots of microorganisms in the water, and some of those will be pathogens. So by increasing the nutrients, you're making lots of algae, which are in turn making more pathogens able to exist in the water, which then attack the corals biologically. So nutrients, terribly bad. So this is the, I guess, a summary of these kind of effects. Okay, so we've got all of the kind of things that can happen to a coral. So it's calcification rate, tissue thickness, all this kind of things, and we can do stuff to them. Okay, so if we increase the amount of sediment, so this is if we have a river coming in bringing lots of sediment. If we chop down all the trees in Queensland, there'll be lots more erosion. We'll add lots of sediment. Okay, that will reduce the light, so it'll reduce calcification. The zooxanthellae will go down. There'll be less photosynthesis. Okay, down is bad. Okay, so that goes kind of almost hand in hand with light reduction, so sediments cut out the light. But the impact of nutrients is a little bit more kind of nuanced in that, yes, so it will have this effect of calcification. The corals will be less happy. They might have more zooxanthellae because there's more nutrients available for those algae to grow inside the coral. So maybe photosynthesis might go up. But that might have some effects on producing too much oxygen maybe, which will be toxic. So too much oxygen is toxic. They don't breathe 100% oxygen if anyone ever asks you. Okay, so it can have all of these other effects on the life cycle through how they kind of reproduce and how their embryos are able to settle on rocks and stuff like that. So nutrients also mostly bad, sometimes good. Yeah, so I won't skip on that one. But effectively, well, I'm supposed to say corals. Or no, it is. It just is. I didn't mess up that slide at all. So I guess to summarize, we've got all these problems, right? So we've got the problem that we're acidifying the ocean, so that's making it harder for these corals to grow. Okay. We're also adding temperature. We're adding heat to the ocean. okay, because it's, you know, because of, yeah, which is basically dicks. So we're adding, and that's causing the corals to want to bleach more, okay, because it's too hot for them, and we're acidifying the ocean, which means that they're more likely to bleach. We also have things that may be going on a more local scale. Okay, so we could be adding nutrients through surface runoff or tourism developing. Okay, if you build a big hotel next to a coral reef, there's a lot of sewage that goes directly into the sea. We might be changing land use, which might add sediments to the coastal environment, which might smother some corals. There are also these other things that go on, so overfishing. So if you take away all the fish, okay, fish eat algae, right, sometimes. They also eat corals. But if you take away the fish, then nothing's eating the algae, which means the algae takes over and smothers the corals. We also have all kinds of local pollutants in terms of, you know, hydrocarbons going into the water or heavy metals. So we have local stresses. So I guess one of the questions, which is not really going to be covered by this course at all, is it possible to do anything about these things? Okay, either at a global scale or a local scale. Okay, so this is kind of thing, if you are kind of interested in this kind of thing, there are all these things that we could kind of think about trying to do, kind of restoring reefs. We could maybe think about transplanting corals into colder environments to try and preserve them in some kind of refuge. We could have marine protected areas to stop overfishing. These are kind of questions that might get addressed in the future by people like you, because these unfortunately are now your problem. So sorry about that from the old people, but we kind of ruined it. So if this is something that interests you, which it should, because it's really interesting, lots of interesting science and policy problems here. There's a course in the 4th year, Marine Systems and Policy, and possibly another course on coral reefs that may exist soon. So think about doing those. It's nothing to do with me, so you don't have to endure this. But maybe something you can think about in the future. So to summarize from today, so we basically covered briefly what a coral was and that they bleach because the water gets hot. That bleaching is made more likely to happen by us stressing out the corals, and that can be either through changing the pH or changing the nutrient loading in the water. Okay? But it's not just that simple. There are these day-night cycles, and it's those extremes in the day-night cycle which really determine how viable that ecosystem is. And you get this variability that's dependent really on how much exchange there is between the water in the open ocean, okay, where the pH is relatively constant, and these isolated little basins where these local effects of photosynthesis and calcite production can have really big effects on the local carbon pool. Nutrients tend to be bad. Okay? Right. That is the end of that. I suggest we have a quick break because you've been sitting here very patiently. And then we reconvene here in 5, 10, 5, 10. Any advances on 10? Steady. All right, 10 minutes.